Thank you. Over to you, Anthony. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining me on what is a very topical subject for discussion at the moment, and certainly a subject that's popping up in a number of the organisations that we work in quite often. A lot of discussion around things like should we be measuring TRIFR? Is zero harm the right focus? And a lot of conversation around the drawbacks and the issues surrounding a lead indicator focus on safety. However, a lot of organisations really struggling to grapple with what to replace that with. So the purpose of today is to unpack lead and lag indicators, talk about different ways to consider measuring safety performance, and to really think about how we can begin those conversations and a process of refining those metrics within our organisations. Sarah's done the kind introduction to me. For those of you who are not familiar with Sentis as an organisation, we've been around for going on 20 years now, and our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. Myself and many of my team have a background in psychology, so a big part of our focus in improving safety cultures is to, as Sarah mentioned, create organisational conditions which enable people to make the best possible choices to get themselves home safe to things, people, and places that matter most to them. We're going to tackle today's fairly meaty topic in 4 steps. We're firstly going to have a look at, well, what is a lead and lag indicator? We'll do an overview of that. We're going to look at the current challenges attached to each. We'll talk a little bit about what good looks like, and then give you some considerations on where to start in measuring, in where to start this conversation in your organisation, or how to continue to shape it if you've already started that conversation. I'm going to kick off this session with a question for you. So I'll invite anyone who's open to jump into the chat box, and I'd invite you to put down, how does your organisation measure safety success? So, if there was a number or a metric or a couple of numbers or metrics which the organisation would typically say, yes, we're winning in safety, or no, we're not winning in safety, which is the one which, where do you get most of the focus? So I invite you to pop into the chat. Where does your organisation focus? So we've got 1, number of lost time injuries monthly, all based around what is required in tenders, LTIFR, employee competency, no LTIs, injury frequency rate, hazard reporting, the usual TRIFR, happy staff. Okay, so some really good information coming through here. Engagement at toolboxes, not measurable, it is measurable. Maybe we need to catch up and have a chat about that one, Ivan. TRIFR, hypo, near miss, okay. Yep, so a lot of lag indicators with a little bit of lead indicator stuff in there. So we've got an annual survey in here as well. TRIFR, closure of priority actions related to critical risk and safety walks, hypo. Yeah, okay, so excellent. Okay, so they keep rolling in. So a lot of really interesting information there. We'll actually add some of this de-identified information to our own database, because we've run this process a few times, and we tend to find that the way that organisations measure safety success are clumped into the areas on the pie chart here. So far and above incident rates are the ones that seem to get the most focus and the most priority, followed by things like some of the lead indicators, which are often difficult to define for people, audit results, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but a huge focus predominantly on those lag indicators. Another quick poll I'll ask Sarah to jump up on the webinar. How much focus does your organisation put on lead indicators? So we've got a lot of lag indicator stuff come through, but how much focus does your organisation put on lead indicators? None, some, quite a bit, or it is our key focus? Curious to hear your feedback. I'll share what our previous results have come through as well. How are we going there, Sarah?
Yeah, nearly there.
Great.
Just a few more seconds.
Excellent.
Okay. I'm sharing it.
Okay, so we've got none at about 12%, some at 58%, quite a lot at 12%, and it's our key focus at 9%. Jeevers, that is very, very interesting and actually very, very close to the data we've collected to date. So we've got none at about 14%, some at 50%, quite a lot at 29%, and 7% as our key focus. So eerily similar results there. So this is telling us that this is an issue across a number of different industries when it comes to effectively managing safety. So this topic, when I actually decided we were going to run a webinar on this, I had a bunch of colleagues and people say, oh, do you really want to go there? Do you really want to open up this can of worms? Because there are such strong opinions and strong beliefs around things like zero harm, lead and lag indicators, and people become nearly bordering on aggressive, particularly when we talk about topics like zero harm and is that the right thing to focus on or not. At Sentis, we really try and take a very pragmatic approach to understanding what needs to be measured. And as we're going to explore as we go through this, any metric that you put it into an organization has the potential for positive and negative consequences, depending on how they're interpreted, how they're focused on, how they're rewarded and recognized, and where you are in terms of maturity. So we'll kick off by tackling the idea of zero harm. And is zero harm inherently bad? Well, I'm going to start by suggesting that, in fact, when zero harm first came out, the intent and some of its initial effects were probably really positive within industry. It was, I guess, adopted by a number of organisations to basically say we're not going to tolerate factoring in fatalities into our operations. We're going to make deliberate steps to make sure that people don't get hurt. So I think there's been some really positive focuses and the tolerance of safety injuries and fatalities has certainly shifted, and obviously legislation and things has impacted on that, but the zero harm focus, I think, was rolled out initially with a very strong and positive intent. Unfortunately, what's happened over time, due to how we reward and recognise things, how we win work through tenders, and I think someone put that up there earlier, that LTIFR is one of the key metrics that helps them in tendering. It's often what boards will look at to determine whether we're winning or losing around safety. There's a lot of motivation to actually fudge the numbers. There's a lot of motivation that gets trickled through the organisation to underreport and to manage incidents in a way that reduces the outcomes. So I think for a lot of organisations where they're currently at in their journey, from what we're seeing at the moment, is zero probably isn't getting them the desired result in terms of focus and driving the right sorts of behaviours within organisations. However, they're struggling to know what to replace it with. The other aspect that we tend to find from a psychology perspective is you're kind of focusing people on an absence of something and what you don't want, as opposed to what you do want. And what we know from a psychology perspective and from a motivational perspective is to give clear and tangible focuses for people, give people something positive that they can engage with and focus on, really helps to drive and motivate people towards those things. So saying to people, just don't get hurt, doesn't actually give people tangible actions they can take necessarily not to get hurt. And also focusing on what you don't want as opposed to what you do want becomes part of the challenge as well. And we'll all remember probably learning to drive the car, and our mother or father was saying, don't hit the gutter, don't hit the gutter. That becomes the focus, and that inevitably seems to be what happens. We hit the gutter. So from a psychology perspective, we'd probably argue that focusing on what we want people to do, as opposed to in terms of some practical, tangible things, as opposed to the avoidance of something, is probably better focus. The other challenge with zero harm is there's a danger of reinforcing a focus on the negative, especially if it's tied to reward and recognition programs. So if we are tying people's, if there's monetary rewards tied to lost time injury frequency rates, well, that will drive people to perhaps not report, not be transparent, not give the information that's required to proactively manage safety. Another challenge is how do you keep people motivated after an incident? So we've said to people, all right, if we can go 100 days, TRIFR free, we'll give everyone a Waco fridge freezer. We have that incident on day number 50, you're kind of resetting. And then lastly, using lag indicators as an external benchmark. So with the boards I'm chatting to at the moment, they're saying we can't possibly move away from lag indicators and having lost time injury or total recordable injury frequency rates as our key safety metric, because that's what we benchmark ourselves in industry against. I guess a word of warning there is that just because you might have a TRIFR of 6 and someone else has a TRIFR of 12 doesn't actually mean that one is any more safe than the other. A lot of those metrics can be influenced by how incidents and injuries are managed and reported. We all know the different levers that can be pulled to create more positive TRIFR outcomes that perhaps aren't completely reflective of performance. So I think using TRIFR as an industry benchmark it's fraught with issues. I think perhaps looking at it for yourself and making sure you've got consistent reporting patterns may be okay, but as an industry benchmark, it's really tricky. The other aspect of this is just because you've got a TRIFR of 0 doesn't mean you're actually running a safe organization, and doesn't mean that if you do have a significant injury on site and you're required to stand up in a court of law. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is just being able to say, well, we've had a TRIFR of 0 for the last X amount of time, so we're safe. That's not necessarily a typically legally defensible position. So 0 itself does not necessarily mean safe, and as a benchmarking tool can sometimes be quite challenging. So to sort of roll this up a little bit more, again, lag indicators, in our perspective, possibly were a positive, but they've often led to some more negative outcomes in organisations at the moment. They tend to be focused on the absence of bad. They're often qualitative and lack context, so we don't necessarily get a good story out of that lag data. We just look at the number. We don't seek to necessarily understand deeper more often. We can often mistake past performance for the predictor of future performance. We can set targets for lag indicators, and then we incentivize around those, and that can trigger gaming. What we see in organizations is that we see a challenge that trickles from the board all the way to the floor, because the board will look at a TRIFR rate, for example, and say, well, it's plateaued, or it's up, or it's down, and there will often be a drive to reduce that one focus without necessarily understanding sometimes the nature of those incidents, the potential. We're going to talk about how to get more out of lag indicators in just a moment. So what that can mean is, because of that obsessional focus on TRIFR when it comes to safety or lost time injury frequency rates, there can sometimes be a disconnect between the business strategy and safety. They can create cynicism in the workforce because there's a sense that the organisation only cares when something goes wrong with safety. Can lead to a negative safety culture because we lose sight of the vision and just focus on a number. It can drive under-reporting, reduce discretionary effort, and failure to learn from mistakes, because that trust culture can be eroded because we're just looking at that one number sometimes and not necessarily digging deeper. That being said, we're going to argue that we shouldn't disregard lead metrics as a whole, because we do believe that they can play an important role if used and interpreted effectively. They can help with, again, internal benchmarking. They can help us to tell a story around different aspects of safety. But what we would be really challenging organisations to consider is the way we're looking at those lag indicators helpful to create a story? And this comes into this next slide. What we'd suggest is benchmarking externally isn't useful, but looking at lag indicators in terms of how do they help us solve a problem? How do they help us gather more information? How do we learn from this in a way that's going to improve our safety and performance? That's where they can potentially be quite useful, and quite useful for actually determining what future lead indicators may need to be put into place. So some of the lag indicators in action piece that we'd be challenging you to think about is, first of all, what does the story tell us? How can we use the information to manage future risk? How are lessons learned and communicated? What opportunities are there to solve problems with the workforce? And how do we build lead indicators out of these lag indicators? So I'll give you an example of how this might play out. So one organisation we were working with recently, their lost time injury frequency rate was fairly static at, let's say, 15 rolling lost time injuries per year. The board looked at these lost time injuries and they said, oh, that number's been pretty static now for about a year and a half, 2 years. That's not good enough. We need to drive different outcomes. We need to drive different actions throughout the organisation. And that was a focus. So there was a mad scurry to say, all right, well, how do we reduce these incidents? So they came and had a chat to us. The interesting thing is, if you looked at those incidents over a period of time, although they were fairly consistent from a number perspective, when you actually looked at things like, well, what were the actual consequences of those incidents and what was the potential of those incidents, it told a really interesting kind of story. What it identified is that if you just looked at severity, there were some changes in severity. What we also were able to identify is there was a lot more reporting. Reporting had increased by nearly 50% across the organisation. So they were getting a lot more data in and a lot more incidents and near misses actually reported. What was also identified is that there was big focus on severity and actual outcomes, but not a lot of focus on the potential of those incidents. So what I mean by potential is, if we looked at those 15 incidents, I think out of all of them, I think 14 of the 15 were sprains and strains, and the other one was a car accident. But if you looked at those sprains and strains, actually some of the one there wasn't a lot of focus on the potential of those incidents. And if you looked back over 2 or 3 years worth of data, you could look at those incidents and see, all right, well, sprains and strains are a consistent theme. So one, we need to potentially focus more specifically on that. But the nature of those sprains and strains varied in terms of what potentially could have happened. So the data under TRIFR and has been reported to the board, a rolled ankle and a gutter was getting treated the same as perhaps falling off a ladder, where the potential of that incident was very, very different. So what that organisation was able to do was able to unpack, using a potential model that we supported them with, what was the potential of those incidents, which ones had the SIF potential, so a serious injury or fatality potential, and what were the circumstances in which those incidents took place, and what commonalities could we find in terms of weak signals or lead indicators. So those weak signals or lead indicators actually can now get flipped over into positive actions that the organisation can drive, whether it's around supervision or communication. There are a range of those different things that came out of play. So the challenge in that instance wasn't necessarily that collecting and reporting on lag data was a problem. It was that the lag data was looking at as a single point, as opposed to digging into that information and saying, well, what story does this tell us which could inform future positive action? So what we would suggest is, if a lag indicator only tells part of the picture, what do we need to see the full picture? So we'd be suggesting that focusing on lead inputs or lead indicators helps us to get a more complete vision of what's actually happening within the organisation. And that enables us to take more positive actions within to drive positive safety outcomes. So there's been lots of discussion in this session today and in lots of previous sessions about the importance of focusing on those lead indicators. However, if there's so much importance focused on lead indicators, why don't we have an established set of lead indicators, and why aren't more people doing this? And as we saw in the graphs earlier, it's not a big part of the conversation for a number of organisations. The big challenges we see coming up often is that it's difficult to necessarily prove a connection between a lead indicator and a lag indicator. So we'll have an organisation say roll out a positive leadership engagement piece where leaders are engaged to go out and have safety conversations in field, because perceptions and supervision have been identified as one of the weak signals that led to some serious injury events potentially taking place. An organisation might get an uptick in their safety performance, but then, is it because of that supervision, or is it because of something else that took place? So we can sometimes get bogged because, correlation doesn't necessarily always mean causation. And sometimes you're actually hypothesizing, all right, well, if we do this, it's going to have this outcome. So organizations get quite bogged in rolling those things out and measuring them. That also being said, organizations often then get stuck on the measuring component of this. So how do we measure that? We can measure an incident taking place. How do we actually measure the positive things that we put into place. The other big component here is that lead metrics may look different depending on organization's work, their strategy, their risk profile, and their stage of maturity model. So we wouldn't recommend the same sorts of lead indicators for an organization that is in what we would call citizenship. That's an organization that's very engaged and connected and committed to safety. They'd be very different lead indicators than an organization which is counterproductive, where they're really struggling to get their safety culture moving. Some of the struggles with it. But that being said, we wanted to share with you some of the basics to consider at lead indicators to hopefully help you to start to unravel these conversations within your organizations. So firstly, we're going to have a bit of a chat about this idea of what is a lead indicator, because organizations will get stuck in this space of, well, if we've reported something after it's happened, even if it's supposed to be a lead indicator, isn't it actually a lag indicator? So if we're reporting how many in-field interactions we're having after we've had them, is it a lead or is it a lag? So people really tie themselves in knots. So to really simplify this, what we'd encourage you to think about is, instead of focusing on maybe lead and lag indicators, maybe focus on positive versus negative. And what we mean by that is, positive indicators would be things that we want to see go up. We want to see more of this thing. And negative would be the things that we want to see go down. So you might want to see an increase in hazard reporting and a decrease in lost time injuries, for example. So a simple way to sometimes change that language is to, instead focusing on lead and lag, is to focus on positive, so trending up, negative, trending down. And often what you're chasing is one trends up, the other trends down. What we'd also encourage you to do is to keep it simple. So look at your current metrics within your organization. And if you're going to add new ones, don't add a bunch at a time. Maybe look at one, maybe look at two, and have a really good story as to what you're trying to achieve around those. Lead indicator metrics should drive action. So where a lot of lag indicators are measuring, again, things that have taken place, what we're looking for in lead indicators is things that people can focus on that can be tracked and again, should drive action and track up. A bit like on a scoreboard in a football game. If we score more tries, that number tracks up. So it would be things like amount of supervisional conversations inside, or it might be number of near-miss reports, or it might be any range of other lead indicators that we'll talk about before. But what those metrics should be attached to is the types of actions and behaviors that we want people to do more of. We want to make it measurable and review it regularly. So the other part of this is consider what we will measure and how we will review it. And when you start to get up the maturity curve here a little bit, you start moving from a quantity measure to a capacity and capability metric. And that's possibly where it does get a little bit trickier, because quantitative metrics are only going to get you so far before you want to actually move to quality. So it's one thing to measure number of in-field, say, observations we complete. It's a completely different thing to measure the effectiveness and impactful of those. So we got to think outside the box a little bit for those. And lastly, with whatever we're measuring, we want to keep it up front and center. We want to make it visible so people know whether they're winning or losing. So watching sporting games without a scoreboard isn't particularly entertaining or useful. And the same thing goes for measuring these indicators. And I'll talk to you about an example of a dashboard a little bit later on. So considerations in developing lead indicators. So what we'd be encouraging you to think about is, what does your current lag indicator data tell you, and what are the gaps in the story? So how do those lead indicators potentially plug those gaps? What can inform this is what our incident data is telling us. So what are the common weak signals across these? What activities can you implement to support identifying these weak signals? So again, another organization we worked with recently, where we looked at their incident data with them, we identified that incidents occurred at a particular time of the day with a lower level of supervision, without a particular person taking ownership for setting that project up. So that gave some really clear focus areas in terms of how to reduce that risk profile within those particular types of pieces of work. The next one is here, what are your people telling you? So what is the perceptions of your leaders and your leader safety systems? So having a conversation with your workforce, with your leaders, and understanding what's helping or hindering them in driving positive safety behaviors and getting a positive safety outcome becomes a really important engagement piece. And then finally, looking at the quality of your metrics, and then making sure that you've got the basics of those metrics set up to tell you the right story. Okay, so there's some foundations, but how do we actually go about creating that the drive for these outcomes? How do we create a successful implementation of lead indicators? So what we'd suggest is that there's some really important cultural drives that will determine how successfully you can transition to focusing on lead indicators. The first one here is having a clear organizational vision in place that is communicated well by leadership. So what we've found is that in more mature organizations, organizations that are further up the maturity curve that I'm going to share in a moment, and that are more able to get successful and sustained positive safety outcomes, they focus heavily on having a clear organizational vision in place that is communicated well by leadership and has some tangible targets set around it. Supporting that is strong leadership engagement. So those leaders are not only have a clear vision that they're bought into, but they've been skilled up to have the capacity and the capabilities to lead and drive the safe work actions within the organization. The next one is there are systems in place that support safe work. So where organizations aren't doing this particularly well, they tend to have a lot of actual practical barriers to people engaging in positive behaviors that they're asking them to engage with more. And then finally, organizations who do this well are careful to consider their reward and recognition processes. So there's some real challenges attached with associating financial rewards to lag metrics. And you also need to be wary of lead metrics as well, as it can complete compliance rather than a culture of curiosity or continuous improvement. So what we would be really challenging to think about is when you set safety targets, if you do attach commercial rewards to those, take some time to engage with your workforce in some open conversation about, well, if we were to do this, what would be the helpful behaviors that it would drive and what would be the less helpful behaviors that it would drive. The other big component of this with metrics and with culture as a whole is, and again, this is, I think, part of the conversation with this, is it's really not a set and forget kind of model. What we would find in the organizations that we're working with is, depending on your level of organizational maturity, you will have very different requirements when it comes to setting lead indicators. So at Counterproductive, you've got an organization that where people perceive that that the leaders in the organization doesn't care about safety, so they're very much in the same space. That's a very different type of culture to one that's up at Citizenship, where the company's safety is a core part of everyone's job. So as we mature up the curve, we typically tend to see more transactional metrics up to and more quantitative metrics up to more qualitative metrics, where you've got positive safety initiatives that are run from the field and safety suggestion mechanisms that tend to get played out. The aspiration that we work with organizations on typically is safety citizenship. So safety citizenship behaviors look like going above and beyond basic compliance, identifying opportunities to improve safety, creating a willingness to discuss safety concerns with leaders and teammates, looking at voluntary memberships of safety committees, actively engaging with safety initiatives, keeping informed with the latest safety challenges on site, and monitoring safety performance of team members to ensure everyone is working safely. You can also measure things like, and I think one of the indicators that was measured before was pre-start meetings. You can do things like measure the amount of activity and engagement. You can survey people to see how effective and useful they're finding those sessions. I guess defining what good looks like, you can start to measure and track how effective they are. So again, depending on where an organization's at and their particular areas of focus, they're the typical things that we would be looking at. And all of these things are quite measurable in their own way. And underreporting, for example, with this willingness to discuss safety concerns, maybe one of those. So some of the typical lead indicators that we see organisations roll out are on the screen here. So it's less about those and more about where's your organisation at, how do you bring them to life. So again, if we can identify what the goal is, identify and act on the lead measure, keep a score of how we're going and create a cadence of accountability, they're the critical elements to driving that success. So as you consider this for your organisation, what we'd encourage you to think about is review how you reward and recognise safety, agree on the role safety plays in helping the organisation achieve its objectives. So how does a safe outcome drive the organisational objectives that we've set? We want to get clear on our risk profile. So if we can be clear about what our critical risks within the organisation are, if we get clear about what the circumstances and conditions around those taking place are, we can start to set up positive lead indicators attached to that quite practically. We can look at patterns of past incidents and theorise potential interventions. So again, what we'd encourage you to do is to get into your data, look for trends, look for themes, and have a go at some different activities, and then measure and track how they impact on things. Different stages of your maturity and different initiatives will require either qualitative or quantitative metrics. We can be clear about the process of data. You need to be clear about the process of data collecting. So if you're going to set a lead indicator, how are people going to report on that? How do we make it as easy and engaging as possible? And how do we use that data to tell a story that informs positive action? And then finally, the final two are think about your scoreboard and how it's tracked. And then we want to obviously celebrate success when we're achieving those lead indicators. What I thought I'd do as a next step of this to sort of bring this to life a little bit is share a dashboard which comes up actually on my Facebook every single day. And it's one that we're probably all going to be paying close attention to in our own states. And I'm not offering any political views attached to this whatsoever, purely looking at this from what sort of behaviours and what sort of focus are we trying to drive. But popping up on my Facebook today was the COVID dashboard that came up by Queensland Health that tells us how we're going from a COVID perspective. As you can see here, the big focus on this dashboard, where your eye is naturally drawn to, is the cases today, and then that pushes down into your locally acquired, your overseas acquired, and other sources. It talks about active cases, total cases. You've got the number of tests that are completed. And then you got the number of vaccinations. I guess if you're thinking about this from a lead and a lag indicator perspective, I would view a lot of the metrics that are at the top of this dashboard as the lag data, and a lot of the metrics at the bottom of this dashboard as the lead indicator. And Queensland hasn't painted probably as much of a clear roadmap to what's going to happen to return things to some sort of post-COVID normality as Sydney, as New South Wales and Victoria have. But for mine, some of the challenges with this dashboard is a lot of this is focused on, I guess, what the things that we want to avoid again. So we want to have less cases, we want to have less active cases, want to have less lives lost. What I would like to see this dashboard focus more on, if we want to, again, without getting political here, is if we believe that vaccines are one way, vaccines and tests are ways to keep ourselves and people in the community safe, how do we pull that to the top of the focus, and how do we have that data tell a more meaningful story that lets us know whether we're on track or not? So if I look at total vaccines by Queensland Health to date, 1.8 million vaccines. What does that actually mean? What percentage of the community is that? Is that 1 or 2 shots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? With the 23,000, yep, that seems like a lot. Is it a lot? How does that sit against targets? What would we like to be achieving? If we've got a particular goal in mind. Same thing with these tests achieved. Is that a good number or a bad number? The 11,000, and that 4 million tests. Not sure what value that creates in terms of driving the sorts of behaviours that we want to see more of. So again, with this dashboard, it'd be really useful, I think, if we're getting clear about what are our objectives, what are our visions for Queensland when it comes to COVID, And then how do we use these metrics to actually engage people in the community and in Queensland to drive those positive sort of behaviours that the government is saying are good for us in terms of the vaccines and the tests. So again, I just want to take an example that perhaps we can all relate to, being in this COVID world. But that's an example where I think thinking about what you're trying to achieve as an organisation, thinking about your current lead and lag indicators, and thinking about the behaviours you want to drive more of, and how that's reported and how that's tracked becomes really important. So I'm going to create an opportunity now to ask some questions, because we often have a number of questions come through in relation to this topic. And I've actually got one that's come through already. So we've got Cameron here who said, we have near misses as a lead indicator. Not sure if that is wrong or right, but our reasoning for this is just like reporting a hazard or safety observation, the reporting of this allows action to improve before a lag event occurs. Yeah, 100%, Cameron. I would agree that lead indicator, like hazard reporting, would be a positive lead indicator. We often find that organisations that have increasing amounts of lead indicator reporting generally have less underreporting, which is an issue that a lot of organisations want to address. And it can often be indicative of other positive aspects of the organisation, such as the amount of trust that people feel within the organisation. So I think near miss reporting is really possible, is really positive. What I'd also be encouraging to consider is, all right, what's been done with that near miss reporting? What trends and themes can we find, and how do we reconnect that back into the organisation to share those learnings and to show that that data is being used in an effective way? So that's a great question. Any other questions that anyone has, feel free to bring them through. Just having a look at the chat. Yep. So no. Here we go. Here's one from Michael. Difficulty shows with causation and contract labour don't report through fear of losing. Yeah, contract labour don't report for fear of losing work. I agree. I think this is part of the challenge of focusing on predominantly lost time injury frequency rates, is that because they become a critical metric to keep work, and often if those injuries and incidents occur, it becomes a very oppositional conversation. And contractors are very highly motivated in those instances if they want to keep the work to bury those incidents. What would one metric that you believe that every organisation should report? Look, I think what we would typically be encouraging organisations to consider is, and I'm not going to answer that with a couple. I think hazard reporting is really important. So actually getting that information in and seeing that it's tracking in a positive direction is really important. I think obviously we want to record incidents that happen, but where a lot of organisations aren't focusing at the moment is looking at the potential of incidents as well as the actual result of those incidents. So what we're finding in the organisations that we're working with is as many as 35% of incidents where organisations are looking at potential are being miscategorised, and that means that we're sometimes missing the opportunity to address those serious injury and fatality events proactively. Are there any lead indicators that can clearly indicate how effective your systems are at managing risk? Look, I think what we would typically look at in this regard, Martin, would be a lot of the information that we get from the workforce about how effectively, how easily people can engage with the system. Is it a barrier to actually reporting data? And then also looking at how effectively does that system facilitate the closing out of actions and the driving of learnings throughout the organisation. So I think when it comes to how effective your system is. It probably comes down to what are you trying to get it to do. So are you trying to drive people to report more? So does it facilitate that? Are you trying to get better insights and outcomes? Does it facilitate that? Does the information help inform positive actions throughout the organisation? Does it inform that? What else have we got here? Just getting my head around this. What is the best way to convince the board / leadership to change the indicators instead of TRIFR? Okay, really good question, Adam, because this is often where the biggest stuck occurs, because we're sort of getting to the executive level and they're going, we know these things don't necessarily make sense. They don't tell a complete story, but the board's asking for this metric. So that's where we keep on going back to. I think, Adam, it's about giving those board members an opportunity to see the world a little bit differently. So feel free to share this webinar and these resources with them. But often boards will, they might not have a background in safety. They might not have a deep expertise in the space. They might not actually know what they don't know. So helping them to unpack what TRIFR tells, what the other information their data tells, helping them understand, I guess, some of their legal obligations as well, and how TRIFR does or does not tie to those legal obligations, all become, I think, an important part of the conversation. So education is what I'm seeing as a big piece, and then offering up alternates and driving that into the operating rhythm also becomes really important. Got one here from Michael. Can we attach incentives to the thing we want to encourage, such as pre-start participation, incident reporting, rather than incident-free stats? Yeah, look, we can. So there's a couple of ways you could potentially tackle that. You can attach it to activities, or you could, what we see some organizations do is make it more of a values or vision-based thing. So, implementing peer-on-peer reward systems where it's like, hey, Joe Blogs, displayed these positive safety behaviors in this regard, and this is reflective of our values in this way. So this is where you can actually start to talk about, as much as the actual activities, like the types of behaviors that you want to see more of within the organization, and create opportunities to showcase those behaviors and talk about how that impacts on the vision and the organizational outcomes. So again, some organizations are uncomfortable about that, often because they might not necessarily have a really good safety vision or really ingrained safety values, but we'd be encouraging that you consider those as part of getting alignment across your organization. Okay, what are those metrics that measure capacity? Look, that's a very, very tricky one. This is where I think a lot of the conversation around safety differently comes into play, where a lot of safety differently would talk about you can't really measure capacity because it's something that some people build with training and those types of things. So, and in fact, by measuring it, you're not really measuring capacity itself. So you sort of get stuck in a circular argument. So I guess what I'd be thinking about, James, is how do you identify the capabilities or the capacity you want to have within your organization as a starting point, and then worry about measuring it later on. I think just getting clear about your capacity first of all becomes a really important part. And there's some really good stuff in the safety differently space. It's probably a whole nother webinar for that. Would you consider safety training as a good lead indicator, either compliance training or development training? Look, it depends on the quality of the safety training. Just because you attend safety training doesn't mean that it's good safety training. So we'd be looking at the concept of training transfer. So how confident people feel, how capable do people feel that they can apply the learnings from the training once they go back out into the field, and then looking at, all right, well, how do we potentially go out there and observe some of that? So maybe you give some pre-start training, and then is there a way that you can, well, there are ways you can go out and observe that pre-start training and see the transfer of training skills. Maybe it's the amount of participation from the work group, those types of things. So there's checklists and things that you can provide around that and take that in more of a coaching coaching angle. Does reporting hazards work? I've been in an organisation where you had to have at least 5 hazard reports a day from your work group. Most of these were very low consequence. Okay, so this is where, again, setting targets around things can be sometimes unhelpful. So positive intent, right intent, but not necessarily effective execution. So I think educating people more on the why and the what's in it for me and why it's important to report hazards, and then showing a closeout loop would be the more important thing than saying we have to report 5 a day. Because yeah, if you report 5 a day, you'll get 5. If you KPI 5 a day, you'll get 5 a day, but you end up sorting through a bunch of rubbish reporting essentially, and that just creates further cynicism and gives a sense that safety is a box ticking exercise. Finally, which are the good ones? Which are good for an organisation? Which are the good for an organisation leading or lagging indicator? I'm not sure, Rajesh, what your question is specifically there. So if you could retype that one, I'd be happy to answer it.
There's a few chat comments, Anthony.
Okay, great. Lead indicator inspections, senior management, frontline workers, both important, more than the other. Okay, so lead indicator inspections, senior managers or frontline workers, both are important, but one is more important than the other. Okay, which one generates more positive safety culture? Look, again, I think this is possibly a little bit dependent on where your organisation is at and where the potential hotspots are. So we collect a lot of culture data from across a range of different industries, and we recently identified, released a report that specifically focused on utilities, and utilities are identified that there was a significant disconnect from senior management and the front line, or a perceived disconnect from the senior management and the front line. So in that instance, what we would be, and then as a result of that, there was a sense that one didn't understand the other. So in that instance, what we'd be suggesting is looking for ways for senior managers to connect to the work that's done so that they are making decisions that help the workforce feel consulted and considered would become really important. There may be other instances where the conditions are different. So again, understanding the perceptions of your workforce, understanding the barriers to getting jobs done, and getting some data can be really useful to inform some of that. I don't know there's a hard and fast answer on that one, Graham.
We don't have any more questions, and we all know every time I say that we get more. But yeah, I think you've covered quite a lot here, Anthony. What about these other polls?
Yeah, great. So thanks, Sarah. So just as we wrap up for today, a couple of quick options for people to dial into if they would like to. So this first option is to dial into an executive roundtable. So we've run a couple of these now, and they've been really well received, and it gives us an opportunity to sit with your peers across a range of different organisations and to network and to work on a joint problem together. So this particular problem or opportunity for a discussion is on using technology to enable an engaged workforce. So what we'll be discussing in that webinar is sharing learnings around, in that roundtable is sharing examples from across industry about how people are using technology to create positive safety cultures, to gather, to collect information, even to help report around lead indicator information and things like that that we've discussed today. So a great opportunity, as I said, to discuss what's a very topical subject, particularly in this COVID landscape where we're relying more on technology than ever, potentially. So if you've got interest in that, please select yes, and one of our team will get in contact with you to set you up for that session.
Okay. Another one.
Great. And then the final one here is if you're interested in understanding more about our approach to improving safety cultures, our psychology-based approach, you can have access to our Zip Essentials safety, the Psychology of Safety online module. So in that module, you get some really rich content that talks about further helping you understand safety citizenship and how attitudes drive behaviors, and then drive results when it comes to safety. So encourage you to jump on that. Again, click yes if that's something of interest, and you can further understand the psychology of safety.
All right. Okay, well, we haven't, we've come to the end of the session, I think. So, Anthony, once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all. And thank you for investing this time on a really important topic.
Great. Thank you. I'll just give people a couple more seconds to finish that third poll.
No problem.
Otherwise, have a great week.
Thank you.